Good day, with hopes you are doing well. I'm Amy Southerton, Assistant Director at the Center for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at SUNY Plattsburgh, and it's my honor to welcome you to the third session of the virtual Conversations on Canada Spring 2021 series. The Conversations on Canada webinar series is organized by the Center for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at the State University of New York College at Plattsburgh, a United States Department of Education Title VI National Resource Center on Canada, with additional support from the Quebec Ministry of International Relations and La Francophonie. The Conversations on Canada series addresses current issues central to a fuller understanding of Canadian society, with 5 past sessions on topics including 1. Why is Donald Trump mad at Canada? Understanding American foreign policy toward Canada. 2. The pandemic experience. How do Canada and the US compare? 3. The Black experience in Canada. Race, the state and the persistence of social inequality. 4. Home and native land, reconciling experiential Canadas. 5. What if the US had Canada's notwithstanding clause? Constitutional lessons from the North. Recordings of all these past presentations are publicly available on YouTube. To view these past sessions, please visit the Conversations on Canada YouTube channel at tinyurl.com/conversationsoncanada. Thank you to all the members of our virtual audience joining us today for this conversation on Canada titled, Is the Special Relationship Back? Canada-U.S. Issues After 100 Days of Joe Biden, presented by Dr. Frederick Gagnon. We are especially grateful to all the SUNY Plattsburgh students, faculty, staff, and alumni, business people of our New York State, North Country region and beyond, as well as scholarly members of the Association for Canadian Studies in the U.S. who are joining us today. As with our past sessions, we ask if you have any questions or comments you would like to submit, please note the Q&A box on your screen. Again, we ask that questions or comments you have for the panelists be submitted specifically in the Q&A box. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christopher Kirky, Director of the Center for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at the State University of New York College at Plattsburgh, and President for the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States.
Thank you, Amy, very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to be with you today and to have the privilege of having Dr. Frederick Gagnon from UQAM speak to us on a title and on a focus that's very important. It's 100 days or so since Joe Biden has been president, Dr. Gagnon is going to speak to us specifically on that. Let me give you a brief description of his talk in addition to the title that Amy provided. And that is, the election of Joe Biden to the White House brought a sigh of relief to many Canadians who were concerned about the quote unquote special relationship between Canada and the United States during Donald Trump's presidency. While Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, denounced Canadian trade practices, rejected the Paris Agreement dear to the heart of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and left the G Summit in Charlevoix in Quebec in 2018 prematurely, Biden has promised, as we know, to quickly rebuild bridges with the United States' main allies, including Canada. So 100 days after Biden's presidential inauguration, what is the current state of Canada-U.S. relations, and what are the key bilateral issues in trade and economics, border security, climate, energy, and the environment? Today's webinar will provide an overview of Canada-U.S. relations in the Biden era, showing that Trump has left a more lasting imprint on this special relationship than might appear at first glance. Ladies and gentlemen, it's really a privilege, as I said a moment ago, to have my friend Fred Gagnon. Frederick is a full professor. He holds the Raoul Donzeron Chair in Strategic and Diplomatic Studies and is the director of the Center for United States Studies and one more center, the one on multidimensional conflicts at the University of Quebec in Montreal. He's just, he's a prolific scholar, public intellectual, but more importantly, a great person. He's published a variety of meaningful books and scholarly journal articles and chapters on Trump's foreign policy, the United States Foreign Relations Committee, the American Congress, the impact that 9/11 had on US international relations, the intersection between Hollywood movies and the US national security state, and various theories of American foreign policy. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, mesdames et messieurs, please join me in welcoming Dr. Frederick Gagnon. Fred, please.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here. Thanks for the generous introduction. I want to try to share my slides. I hope it's going to work. Is it working? Yeah, okay. And I'm going to make it full screen. Okay. Thank you so much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to be there in person though, but the border is closed, so I can't. But I know I'm gonna go back to SUNY Plattsburgh at some point, and it's gonna be a pleasure to see you guys. Amy, Chris, I had a wonderful time when I was with you at the Center for the Study of Canada and at the Institute on Quebec Studies in 2014 when I was a visiting Fulbright Canada Research Chair. South of the border in Plattsburgh, not so far from Montreal, and it was a great time. I learned a lot about Canada-U.S. relations while I was there. And today's presentation, as Chris said, will focus on Joe Biden, and I'll talk about Joe Biden later during the presentation. But I want us to go back in time for a while. Let's take the DeLorean. You're familiar with the movie Back to the Future. Let's take the DeLorean for a minute and go back to 2014. As I said earlier, I was a visiting scholar at SUNY Plattsburgh in 2014. And Chris, this is the presentation I gave in 2014. That's the first slide for this project that I was working on. It was titled Upstairs Neighbors, Quebec-U.S. Relations and the Impact of La Belle Province on U.S. Elections. And I wanted to talk about this project today because what I did in 2014 was a turning point in the way I do research about Canada and Quebec-U.S. relations. And I want to thank you for that. At the time, and you're going to know why later, at the time I was, of course, reading about this literature on Canada-Quebec-U.S. relations. And most of the authors who write about Canada-Quebec-U.S. relations will tell you that there's a special relationship between our societies. It's a very, very important relationship, multiple connections between our society, historical connections because, for instance, 900,000 French Canadians crossed the U.S. border to find jobs in the U.S. between 1840 and 1930 in Lowell, Massachusetts, for instance. Economic connections, well, Earl Fry is a scholar who's worked a lot on the economic connections between Canada, Quebec, and the U.S. I would encourage you to read his research about that. We all know the numbers, the millions of jobs in the U.S. that depend on the relationship with Canada. Carl Grenier, a good friend of mine, used to say that more than 500 jobs in Quebec depend on the relationship with the U.S., so strong economic ties. Cultural ties because of Celine Dion, of course. National security connections because of the border. We have a big issue right now with the closure of the border to non-essential travel. I'm going to talk about this a little later. And political connections between our societies are very strong too, because of Canada's diplomatic presence in the U.S., but also because of Quebec's subnational presence in the U.S. thanks to its network of delegations and offices in cities like Washington, Chicago, New York, and so on. So I was reading the literature in 2014. It says there's a special relationship between Canada, Quebec, and the U.S., but at the same time, it tells you that Americans don't really pay attention to Canada-U.S. issues, to Quebec-U.S. issues. Colin Robertson is a former diplomat, Canadian diplomat who worked at the Washington, D.C. embassy for a while. And in 2005, he wrote this article in Policy Options that says, I'm often asked, what do Americans think of us? And the short answer is they don't. Americans don't really don't really talk about Canada, don't really talk about Quebec, Canada, Quebec-U.S. issues, unless, says Colin Robertson, if their district is close to the Canadian border. So when I was at SUNY Plattsburgh, what I did is I was based at the Center for the Study of Canada, and I told Chris, you know, I'm going to take my car and drive around the states that share a border with Quebec to see during the 2014 elections how Americans talk about Quebec-U.S. issues, about Canada, about Quebec, relying on Richard Fennell's method in his book, 1978 book called Home Style, House Member in Their Districts. I drove around, interviewed electoral candidates, Democratic candidates, Republican candidates, local journalists, everybody I could talk to, voters, just to know more about how Americans perceive Canada, perceive Quebec, perceive Canada, Quebec, U.S. issues. And I published at the time the results of this research in the journal Quebec Studies in 2016. If you want to look at this article, if you're curious about the research I did at the time, well, here are the takeaways that you will find in this research. First of all, well, I told you about the literature. I think that it underestimates the importance of Canada, Quebec, U.S. issues in U.S. public debates, U.S. electoral debates. Of course, Canada, Quebec are not a priority usually in the United States and in electoral debates. And that's pretty much what happened in 2014. But still, Canada, Quebec, U.S. issues drove crucial electoral discussions in the states I studied, where the close ties with Canada, Quebec influenced what voters, interest groups, the media, electoral candidates defined as issues of importance to their districts and states. So of course, at the time in New Hampshire, people were talking about the Northern Pass project, a transmission line that Hydro-Quebec and its partners in the state wanted to build to export more hydroelectricity to the US. There was, as you remember, a North Train explosion in Lac Mégantic in Quebec. It was interesting to see that people in the state of New York were talking about Lac Mégantic because they also feared that kind of catastrophe that could occur next close to cities like Albany, Plattsburgh, et cetera, et cetera. And I wanted to talk about this project because another takeaway of the article is that most of the people and actors I talked to at the time seem to define the relationship between Canada and the US in these terms. It's a special relationship, just like Dumbrell and Schaefer and David Aglund, another scholar, has a chapter about Canada-US relations in this particular book. And other authors have said, you know, Canada and the US have a very special relationship, is cordial most of the time. Of course, Canada and the US fight. Sometimes the softwood lumber issue, the mad cow disease issue that led Americans to fear Canadian beef at some point in our recent history. But all in all, on a day-to-day basis, most of the people I talked to in the states that I visited in 2014 told me, you know, we don't really talk about Canada because you're not a problem. Of course, we fight on a few issues here and there, but all in all, it's a very cordial, special relationship. Then came Donald Trump, of course, in 2016. And Donald Trump, as we remember, Amy asked the question, why was Trump mad at Canada? I don't know why, but he was certainly not convinced that the Canada-US relationship is as special as some say, especially on trade. If you look at the literature, you see the authors here. Scholars debate the way we should define Trump's views of international trade during his presidency, Trump's views of trade with Canada. Some say this was economic nationalism, others say it was protectionism. I'm not going to debate here this here today, but I think it's fair to argue that President Trump's vision on trade with Canada was based on at least 4 ideas. First of all, globalization, trade agreements, and unfair trade practices have allowed most countries to take advantage of the US in recent decades, including Canada. Secondly, Canada has always been a key partner of the United States, but it should not necessarily be considered an ally on all issues all the time and without conditions. So this idea that there's a special relationship between our countries, yes, okay, says Donald Trump, but it doesn't mean that there are no important issues that should be addressed between our countries. Third idea, although Canada is a key partner, Trump tended to see trade as a zero-sum game where any country's win is considered another's loss. So Trump said, you know, we should renegotiate NAFTA. Trade deficits with Mexico and Canada are a problem. et cetera, and US trade policies, fourth idea, should give priority to the reconstruction and reindustrialization of US communities. And Trump also believed that it's better to create jobs in the US than in other countries, including Canada. And he repeated that during his presidency, saying, for instance, that you all know the drill now, but I want to talk about this a little bit because I think this has left a mark, and it's still in the marketplace of ideas in the US today. So he did not hesitate to define Canada as a challenge. NAFTA was the worst trade deal ever, according to him. The US should not hesitate to impose tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, to force Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to renegotiate NAFTA the way Donald Trump wanted it to be renegotiated. And you all know the debate about the dairy industry. Donald Trump said that Canada has made business for Wisconsin farmers very difficult, other border states, et cetera, et cetera. So let's take the DeLorean again. Let's go back to 2014. What I saw on the ground was that most of the local actors I talked to were saying, you know, this is a very special relationship. There's no problem here. What I did after that is I was curious to know what kind of impact these ideas that were put forward by Trump during his presidency would have on the local actors that I had studied in 2014. What's the impact? How do they perceive Canada and Quebec now? So I applied for a grant, and I was lucky enough to get it from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada to try to study that, building on what I had done in 2014. And the good news here for me, because it's quite time consuming to travel around these states, conduct the interviews, et cetera, it takes time. The good news here is that the funding allowed me to build a team, a research team. So I have a co-researcher for this project. His name is Christophe Cloutier-Roy. We work with a research team at the Center for U.S. Studies at Université du Québec à Montréal, where 5-6 MA PhD students work with us and gather data about the impact Trump has had on the local actors that I did in 2014. So this study looks at how voters, interest groups, local media, electoral candidates and their staffs debated Canada-Quebec-US issues in 10 states this time. That's what we did in 2018, during the 2018 midterm elections. So in 2014, I had studied New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. This time, we also traveled to the Midwest to conduct these interviews. In 2020, we wanted to do the same thing, but because of the pandemic and the closure of the border to non-essential travel, we could not do everything we wanted. In terms of data, we look at polls, of course, but the problem sometimes is that it's difficult to find polls about some of the issues we were studying. For instance, what do Americans in Maine think about the NESEC project, which is another transmission line that Hydro-Quebec and its partners want to build in the state to export more hydroelectricity in New England. It's hard to find polls about these issues. You don't find many polls about that. And that's why we think the qualitative data that we gather, thanks to Richard Fendel's methods, but also, you know, field research and interviews, but also content analysis of campaign websites, of electoral debates, of local newspaper articles, is the way to go here, in addition to the polls that we can find. So what we did in 2018 is we again traveled to these states, just like I had done when I was at SUNY Plattsburgh in 2014. This time we conducted a bunch of semi-structured interviews again in the 10 states that I mentioned. So here is Christophe Cloutier-Roy, when we talked to people working at Sierra Club who are interested in climate and energy issues, of course. And we went to a campaign rally in Ohio, a Mike DeWine campaign rally. We could talk to members of his staff, local journalists at the time. This is us in 2020. We were lucky enough to meet Joe Biden in Manchester, New Hampshire during the primaries. And this is our team at the New Hampshire Democratic Party headquarters in Concord, New Hampshire in February 2020. But the problem is the pandemic happened. So it was difficult to continue this research, but we were able to gather the other data that I mentioned. And you can find some of our findings in a few publications. This article in the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal that was published in 2020 about Donald Trump's impact on Canada-U.S. issues in the Great Lakes Heartland and Northeast borderlands, and also in this book that I edited with two French scholars, and I have a chapter on Trump's views of trade with Canada. And if you want to know more about our conclusions, we're not entirely done with the project. There's another book coming out in the fall where we will look at various issues of the relationship, local, regional perspectives. But one of our conclusions is that Trump has successfully put Canada and Canada-U.S. issues at the forefront of political and electoral discussions in many states we study. When I was there in 2014, local actors were saying, you know, we don't talk that much about Canada. Sometimes, yes, on this issue or that issue, but it's not a big part of the conversation. 2018, I can tell you that was different. Canada was on the minds of many local actors, way more than what we had seen in 2014. And one of our conclusions, building on Richard Neustadt's work on the US presidency, is that President Trump, just like the other presidents, has had one power, which is the power to persuade other political actors that the policies that should be followed are the ones that he proposes. And we argue that he was able to persuade many, not all the local actors we interviewed. I'm not saying that everybody believed what Trump said, but we saw a difference between 2014 and 2018. And I think it's still critical for the future of the special relationship between Canada and the US, because of course, when voters, when candidates, when elected officials talk about Canada, usually not all the time, but it can mean sometimes that there's a problem, that there's an issue, that there's not something that needs to be fixed. And that's what we saw on the ground. And in Le Devoir on November 2018, we wrote an op-ed piece about this, saying that the difference between 2014 and 2018 was a but. Why a but? In 2014, most of the time, people were saying, you know, it's a special relationship. We love Canada. 2018 was, we love Canada, but there is this, but there is that. We want the tariffs on steel. We want the tariffs on aluminum. Wisconsin farmers are not feeling good right now because they don't have enough access to the Canadian market. And again, I'm not saying that this was all the actors that we interviewed. I can give you examples of actors who didn't echo Trump's views of trade with Canada. In August 2018, for instance, Republican Governor of Vermont, Phil Scott, said that Donald Trump's attitude towards Canada was disrespectful, and he promised to strengthen trade ties with Quebec. The North Country Chamber of Commerce, based in Plattsburgh, also publicly emphasized the importance of trade between Canada and the US throughout this period. So I'm not saying that everybody echoed Trump's views, but we saw that some local actors, and more than in 2014, because became skeptical of the relationship, especially on trade with Canada. I'm going to give you a few examples. In an interview at the headquarters of the Republican Party of Minnesota and Minneapolis, one of the party's directors told us that voters in the state's Iron Range region, where iron production is essential, supported Trump's tariffs on Canada because, quote, it's always better to create jobs here in the United States than north of the US border. Interviews at the Republican Party of Maine headquarters in Augusta led us to similar conclusions. Echoing Trump's view that trade and globalization hurt jobs, one of the party's directors stated that the Maine lobster fishing industry considers Canada an adversary because of its trade agreement with Europe, which gives Canadian fishers an advantage over their US competitors in the market. And of course, in Wisconsin, Trump's belief that the Canadian dairy industry is taking advantage of the US was echoed by many local actors. That's in 2018. In the 2018 election, we saw many examples of that, and on both sides of the aisle. So Democratic elected officials, candidates for office, like Senator Tammy Baldwin here, who talks about the unfair trade practices towards Wisconsin dairy farmers, but also Republican elected officials and their staff. I'm not saying that everything changed again. I want to emphasize this, but there was certainly a difference between 2014 and 2018. Now I'm going to talk about Joe Biden a bit, because the third conclusion of our research project so far is that something changed, of course, and that because of that, Canadian and Quebec diplomats and advocacy efforts in the US will remain critical in the years to come, even though Joe Biden has left the White House. There's work to be done there to rebuild, to renew that relationship. And if you look at various polls in Canada, you see that Joe Biden, of course, is more popular than Donald Trump was. You see that Canadians tend to think Biden and Justin Trudeau will be able to renew that relationship. And that's exactly what Biden and Trudeau announced last February after the first official meeting. That was a virtual meeting, but they met and they unveiled what they call a roadmap for a renewed US-Canada partnership. And what I'll do for the rest of the presentation is I'll focus on 3 points of the roadmap to illustrate some of the major challenges and opportunities facing Canada and the US in the months and years to come. And because I know some of you are interested in the role Quebec can play, the Quebec government can play on these issues, in addition to the federal government of Canada, I will talk a little bit about Quebec as well. So first of all, the roadmap says that the top priority of Biden and Trudeau is to end the COVID-19 pandemic, of course. We all know it's a big issue for health reasons, but also for economic reasons, because I told you that the impact that the closure of the border has on research, that's one area where you see a big impact, but the closure of the Canada-U.S. border to non-essential travel has also led to losses in many cross-border industries, as we know, such as tourism. The problem right now is that if you look at vaccination campaigns on both sides of the border, you see that the US is going way faster than Canada. Even Jack Tapper talked about it on CNN a few days ago. You have the numbers on the screen. The CDC says that 41% of Americans have received at least one dose of vaccine, compared to 29% in Canada. We also know that 27% of Americans are fully vaccinated, compared to only 2.7% in Canada. In the Biden-Trudeau roadmap, both leaders agreed to take a coordinated approach, quote, based on science and public health criteria when considering measures to ease Canada-US border restrictions in the future. But I think it's fair to argue that the relatively slow pace of vaccination in Canada could delay negotiations. And Justin Trudeau was on a TV show yesterday. The TV show is called Tout le monde en parle. It's a show that's very popular in Quebec, and he was asked a few questions about the border. And you see that as CBC Washington correspondent Alex Panetta said a few weeks ago, after conducting interviews with officials in Canada and Washington, you see that neither Washington nor Ottawa has clearly defined what it will take to reopen the border to non-essential travel in the future. So that's a big issue. We'll see what happens with that. And on this issue, I think the Quebec government can play a role in at least 2 ways in the coming months. First of all, in Canada, immunization programs are a shared responsibility between Ottawa and provincial and local governments. So the government of Quebec can help accelerate the reopening of the Canada-U.S. border by increasing the effectiveness of its vaccination campaign on Quebec soil. And in the last weeks, you have seen Prime Minister of Quebec, François Legault, and his Health Minister, Christian Dubé, really go public to try to speed up the process, to try to make sure that people in Quebec would get the shot as soon as possible. And you see that in other provinces too, in Ontario, for instance. But we see that the Quebec government also uses its foreign policy apparatus in the US, especially its network of Quebec offices and delegations in Boston, New York, Washington, etc., to encourage the return of American tourism to Quebec and to promote its rapid recovery as soon as possible and as soon as the border will reopen. That's a big issue in Ontario as well, where the impact of the closure of the border to non-essential travel has had a catastrophic impact on tourism in Ontario. If you talk about Quebec, there was a study, a recent study conducted by Raymond Chabot, Grant Thornton, and Orvat HTL that estimated that the loss of tourism in Quebec due to the pandemic between April 20 and May 21 would be in the order of 93,000 jobs and $3.9 billion. That's not just because of the closure of the border to American tourism, but we know that many Americans come to Montreal in the summer to go to the jazz festival. They come to Quebec in the winter to ski at Mont-Tremblant. And sometimes my friends cross the border to have an IPA with me downtown Montreal. That's not possible right now, as we know. The second objective that Biden and Trudeau talked about last February is climate change, of course. As we know, Biden is proposing a very ambitious climate and environmental plan, a clean energy revolution. And right now, he's trying to convince the US Congress to go forward with ambitious economic stimulus plans, federal grants to create green jobs, increase the production and supply of renewable energy, expand mass transit, and increase the number of electric vehicles in the US. Again, Alex Panetta, I like his work, published a recent report in which he said what we know, but it's going to be interesting to follow this, that this climate plan will have a number of implications for Canada. As Panetta says, some good, some bad, and some to be determined. Panetta in the report talks about, of course, Biden's decision to cancel the Keystone XL. Panetta says, and I kind of agree with that it can be seen as a symbolic blow to the oil sector, revealing that political winds are shifting against it, to use Panetta's words. But Biden's climate plan, of course, has other sectors of the Canadian economy salivating right now. For instance, since Biden's election, the Quebec government has stressed that the US clean energy revolution can benefit from several of Quebec's assets. Of course, first of all, Quebec's hydroelectricity, with the projects underway in the state of New York and in Maine, but also Quebec's critical and strategic minerals, which François Legault, Prime Minister of Quebec, is touting as one of the keys to helping North America move faster into the electric vehicle space. This can be helpful to build more solar panels, wind turbines, et cetera, et cetera. And the timing seems to be good for this sector right now. If you look at a presidential order that was unveiled by Biden in February that says, quote, that the United States needs secure supply chains for such critical minerals and other identified strategic materials. Last year, again, the timing can be good, the Quebec government announced a 5-year plan for the development of such minerals. I learned a few things. I learned that there are critical minerals in the region where I was born, in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean. So that was interesting to read about that. So one of Quebec's some national foreign policy goals in the next 4 years will be to attract investment in these sectors and try to convince American counterparts that the US clean energy revolution can count on safe supplies nearby, just north of the border. And the third and final issue that I wanted to talk about here is and Biden and Trudeau talk about this in the roadmap, is job creation on both sides of the border. And here, of course, you're not going to learn this. I think you read the news like me, but I think it's very important to follow this issue. Here, a major concern in Canada, of course, is whether and how Biden's promised Buy American measures will affect industries and workers north of the border and in what sectors. Again, there's an interesting presidential order that was signed by Biden here, a January 25 executive order that says, quote, that his economic plans will require or provide a preference for the purchase or acquisition of goods, products, or materials produced in the United States, including iron, steel, and manufactured goods offered in the United States. Good news for Canadians and people in Quebec. The executive order also indicates that the US can grant waivers to certain industries, certain countries, and certain sectors. And when the executive order was released, you saw very quickly Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, say that the federal government in Ottawa knows how to deal with American protectionism, that Ottawa would take a similar approach than the one that was taken during the Trump presidency to try to lobby influential members of the Trump administration, of the presidential administration. They're going to try to do the same in this case, try to connect with local actors that can be seen as allies that could be affected by such measures. And on this issue, we see that the Quebec government is already playing a role also. It's deploying its diplomacy of influence to amplify and echo Ottawa's message about the importance of thinking about post-pandemic economic recovery in North American terms, not just American terms. I'm going to give you just one example of that. There's an initiative called the North American Rebound. You can look it up online. It's a project of the Canadian American Business Council with support from the governments of Quebec and Ontario in this case, businesses across North America also. And it's an initiative that reaffirms the importance of North American supply chain integration, especially in the context of competition with China. So in conclusions, Joe Biden's election brought a sigh of relief to Canadians who were concerned about the future of the special relationship between Canada and the US during Donald Trump's presidency. The Biden-Trudeau roadmap shows that Washington and Ottawa want to rebuild bridges between both countries, and several issues will likely give the opportunity to do so. Climate change certainly can be one, but other issues already suggest, I think, that it will be difficult to return to the situation I saw when I was with you guys on the ground in 2014, where virtually everyone I spoke to would simply say, I love Canada. Two issues that we have to follow in the weeks and months to come. I said this, but the border, when will it reopen? What will be the conditions to cross the border in the future? What's the plan? And second, trade and economics. Trump promised to make America great again. Biden wants to build back better. Different slogans, but the same desire, I think, to create jobs on American soil above all. As Canada Institute Director Christopher Sands wrote a few months ago, quote, Americans were for free trade, even if it hurt them in the short term. That seems to have shifted under Trump, and it will be difficult for the Biden administration to change that totally. And I think that's what we saw in 2018 and a little bit in 2020 as well. And it will be very interesting to verify this when we continue our field research during the 2022 midterm elections. But my little finger tells me that Trump has left a more lasting imprint on that special relationship than many Canadians would like to. And I'm going to conclude here.
Thank you, Frederick, very much for a wonderful presentation. Great overview going back in time, as you put it. And frankly, I always liked the song Back in Time by Huey Lewis in the News, and I never had saw any of the Back to the Future movies, never until last year. And then my daughter made me sit down one weekend and we watched them all. And I loved how you framed that. I think it was very instructive for our audience to think back, not simply to the time that you were here, but in terms of the changing nature of, frankly, this relationship. I've got some questions I want to throw out to you and give you a chance to think about and comment on, if you don't mind. You mentioned some of these are more specific than others. You mentioned that Trump had effectively elevated Canada, unlike in 2014 or so, to near the top of the agenda for local actors. Canada was there now. Now, my question to you is, does that stick? In other words, a lot of that had to do with his complaints specific to NAFTA, right? So NAFTA is renegotiated, rebranded as the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, relaunched. And even if you look at sort of post-USMCA, and you look at the rhetoric coming out of Trump and the Special Trade Advisor, Lighthizer and Peter Navarro and others, the sort of rhetoric that was angry rhetoric that was being directed towards Ottawa and Canada really seemed to subside quite a bit. So my question to you is that for local actors in the post-USMCA period, do you think this is going to stick when you measure it, when you go back in 2022 and you're looking at sort of, you know, midterm congressional elections, for example?
Yeah, that's a very, I'm looking forward to going back and verify that, as I said at the end of the presentation. And that's, we'll get the data in 2022, and that will be interesting to see if we're back to some normalcy, if I can say that. If you look at polls, you see that the USMCA is very popular in the United States. I think I saw 80% of support for that trade deal. So of course, if you look at that, you can argue that Americans are in favor of free trade because they support that new agreement. But you could also say that this trade deal is very popular, not because Americans are for free trade, but because they see this trade deal as more fair than before, because Trump was able, at least it's the perception, to get more from Canada, And I think that this idea might stay in the future. We think globalization can be good, but we have to negotiate these deals and make sure that they're good for American workers first. And I think this idea has gained traction since 2014 and might stay. And if you look at Joe Biden's campaign, he pretty much emphasized that the economic stimulus plans would benefit American workers before everybody else. Yeah. And I see a similarity. The tools are different, of course. Biden wants a clean energy revolution. Trump didn't believe in that, but they both believe that American jobs are a priority.
Absolutely. I've got one more inquiry here before we move on during the Trump period, before we move on to President Biden and Justin Trudeau relationship. And that is, you referenced, and it builds on my earlier inquiry, you referenced this sort of the interjection of the but. I like Canada, but it seems to suggest your remarks that but is still there, and that it may not be as emphatic or as widely felt as it once was, but there's still a bit of reservation or hesitation there.
Yeah, maybe a few more words about that, if I may. You see that the but was there before too. I remember before Trump,
Sure.
Senator Tom Daschle worried about Canadian beef at some point. So there was a we love Canada, but there. Softwood lumber is another issue on which there was a we love Canada, but before Trump. What changed, I think, during the Trump presidency is that there were many, many, many buts. Oops, that's not a good word, but you heard but on many more issues at the same time, if I could put it this way. So it was not one particular bickering for a short period of time, and then we negotiate and find a solution, and we go forward, go back to the special relationship. During that presidency, there were so many issues on a regular basis, and Trump was, of course, tweeting about it. And so in terms of agenda setting, there was a difference here.
Right. There's a question we have here suggesting that Justin Trudeau, the Canadian government, was holding back, if you will, as were undoubtedly a number of premiers, including Premier Legault, during the Trump period, in terms of speaking their mind, if you will, on the U.S.-Quebec, U.S.-Canada relationship. Question is, do you feel that in some respects that might change now? So.
Well, if you look at Ottawa's reaction to Biden's decision to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline project, you see that the response from Ottawa was quite polite, if I could put it this way. Justin Trudeau said, Biden had promised this during his campaign. This is no news. We knew this would happen. We can collaborate with Biden on other issues, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. But, and that's Christopher Sands who says this too. Biden decided to do so very early in his presidency, and the meeting between Trudeau and Biden occurred afterwards. So there was no official talks between both countries before Biden decided to cancel the pipeline. And for Sands, it is maybe a proof that something has changed in the relationship too. So the fact that the president doesn't hesitate to make that decision, even before there's an official meeting with Trudeau, that's something that's interesting.
It is. It truly is. Talking about Biden, When, and going back just briefly to President Trump, when Trump came into office, as you recall, the decision that came out of the Canadian Embassy in Washington, supported by the Prime Minister's office, the Department of Foreign Affairs, was that Canada would go on a full court press with regard to the United States. They would demonstrate to this unknown neophyte president with, as I suggest, no real political experience, why the Canada-U.S. relationship was so vital, why it was so important. And so we repeatedly saw individuals and efforts being made in Washington, across various states, with the executive branch, the legislative branch of government in Washington saying, hey, look, let me explain to you or tell you why we have this wonderful relationship, this special relationship. And clearly that full court press strategy was useless. It didn't work. And I mean, I think there's a nice dissertation waiting to be written there. The truth is that I think it was an ill-conceived approach. That's my opinion. Now, let's say today you're brought into the Prime Minister's office, or go back 100 days ago if you want. What would you tell Trudeau? What would you recommend to his chief policy advisors about how Canada, or if Monsieur Legault brought you in? Well, it's tough right now, granted, we're in a pandemic, and you simply can't necessarily say, oh, what we did with this full court press, with this full court diplomatic effort to underscore the importance of the Canada-U.S. relationship was in and of itself faulty. It just so happened that we didn't have a receptive audience at the White House and amongst his congressional allies. So maybe we should replay that. But what would you say? And I'm going to add one more mix to this. You have to bear in mind, I think anybody who would have to bear, anybody, if you're making a recommendation about how Canada or Quebec moves forward in terms of promoting its interests and promoting the strength and vibrancy of the relationship with the United States, has to recognize that for Biden, his chief foreign policy priorities are not focused on Canada. They are, unlike President Trump, who had a very transactional and very episodic, limited approach to what foreign policy was and why it was important. That's not the case here with Biden. Biden's well-schooled in foreign policy and international relations, and clearly the focus for his White House is Russia and China, followed by places like Iran and Afghanistan. So how do you get Canada and Quebec on the agenda?
It's very difficult. It's a tough question.
It's a PhD qualified.
No. It's a very interesting question, because if you look back at what they did when Trump was there, you can say there were mistakes. It was not perfect, but it was very difficult to deal with the White House, with the renegotiation of NAFTA. How do you do this? I mean, so what they did is they tried to knock on many doors to remind everybody that this relationship is very important. They tried to find local actors who would be affected by the renegotiation of NAFTA, who were affected by steel and aluminum, because when you drink your beer on the weekend, your beer can is in aluminum that crosses the border, so it can affect Americans as well. So I think they did what they could. If you look at the debates in Canada on the way they proceeded, you see that Canadians were quite happy with how Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland did during the Trump presidency. It was a tough situation. What I would say about the future is that if you want to get noticed in the US, I think you will need more resources at some point. First of all, you will need more resources. I look sometimes at the number of people who work at certain Quebec offices on US soil. They are very small teams. And it's very difficult in a more complex world where there's competition. Every country is in the US right now trying to make sure they will get their part of the cake. if Biden's stimulus plan is adopted.
Right.
So if you want to get noticed, you need resources. So I think, and I think that in this context, the old debates that we had in Canada about the fact that Quebec, some national presidents in the US can be a problem because foreign policy should be made by Ottawa. I think you have to stop those kind of debates, because Quebec and other provincial governments maybe can be an asset here if you need more resources.
Agreed.
You need more voices. You need Ottawa to be there and say, Quebec has this, but if Quebec is there too and echo and amplify that message, knock on more doors, I think you give yourself more chances that the strategy will work, but it's not easy.
Agreed. And I think we're in agreement on the fact that the government of Quebec has read this situation very carefully and very astutely. And they're making, by focusing on green energy, by focusing on the availability and security of critical and strategic minerals, that's a huge plus, and it's a smart way to play this right now, given the needs of the United States, and it as you say, in a larger sense, contributes to a stronger Canada-U.S. relationship.
Yeah, and if I can add, we need a change of mentality also, I think, north of the border. Because this literature that I told you about always emphasizes the idea that this is a special relationship. It's always been like that. It's always going to be like that. Well, we saw that it's not the case. It's
Right.
not the case. You cannot take that relationship for granted anymore.
Right.
I think the Trump presidency showed that. So you need more resources, and you need to be smarter in your approach in the future. I'm not saying that they were not smart before, but I'm saying that you cannot take it for granted. You're not going to get everything automatically just because we're friends.
No, it's true. I think there's a clear and obvious case, going back to at least even the Obama years, but certainly the Trump years, and now really obvious in the Biden presidency, that there needs to be a greater commitment by the Canadian government and by governments like Quebec, in terms of increasing not only dollars, but personnel committed effectively to the United States relationship. I think that's very obvious. A couple of people have offered observations and questions regarding, suggesting that the Canada-U.S. relationship, to the extent at a macro level, it begins to function. There's some lubrication to make the relationship move more fluidly, the border issue being resolved, and so on and so forth. Part of it is, what's going on in Canada currently with elevated numbers with COVID-19 variants causing great concern, medical concern across the country. And also this notion that, there's questions about gee whiz, and it came up with India over the last couple of days, where their numbers are spiking dramatically. And as you showed in the chart, where only 2.7% of all Canadians have been fully immunized. If the United States does have some backlog, for example, 30 million or so AstraZeneca shots, which the FDA has not approved for use, why not release them to a country who has approved them? And in the Canada-U.S. relationship, what would you expect? What might we expect the United States to try and do in the months ahead as far as assisting Canada goes?
If we can share more vaccines at some point, I think it would be good. Not just because not just between Canada and the U.S., but you see other countries who have a 0%. If you look at people who are vaccinated, you see 0% in many other countries, and the virus is not disappearing. Right. So we need to vaccine. We need to make sure Canadians and Americans get their shots. But we're not isolated from the rest of the world. And if you see that certain countries still have a problem with COVID-19 in 2-3 years, you're still going to debate this then, and it's going to be an issue. You talk about reopening the border. You think so? No, it's that's the big question mark. Honestly, I don't know what's going to happen with that, but that seems to be an issue that will affect everything else. I was talking about creating jobs on both sides of the border. Well, it's easier when the border is open. It's easier when the border is open, and we don't know when it's going to be open again.
It sure is.
I'm going to be on a sabbatical in 2022. I don't even know if I'm going to be able to do the research I told you about. That's very strange times.
Yeah, I know. Well, you'll have to go to Yellowknife instead or something. One really interesting.
Let's hold a conference there.
Yeah, there we go. We may have to. One interesting observation is that Trump, when Trump served as president, for Justin Trudeau, the position he sort of took vis-a-vis Trump for Canada was one that did him well across, as you suggested, across the Canadian body politic. People were supportive of the position that he took. It reminds me very much, in fact, all he had to do was watch the movie Love Actually, because Donald Trump was effectively Billy Bob Thornton as sort of the bully president, and Justin Trudeau could play the role that Hugh Grant played as the British Prime Minister, where he said, "We're not going to be bullied. We're a country of Shakespeare, and we're a great country." And to some extent, Trudeau did that, and it was popular, and it galvanized Canadian public support for him. Now that Trump's gone, and that sort of Trudeau's foil is no longer an issue, how does that impact, do you think, Canadian domestic politics?
That's very interesting, because we're talking about having an election, a federal election soon. If you follow Canadian news, you see that this election might occur in a few months, maybe in the fall. We don't know yet, but political parties are already on the campaign trail, if I can say it this way. Yesterday, as I said, Justin Trudeau was at Tout le monde en parle, this very popular show. They didn't talk about the relationship with the US that much, which shows what you said. It's difficult now for Trudeau to say I'm different than the leader that's south of the US border. Actually, Joe Biden and Trudeau have very similar ideas on climate, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, the discourse has changed in Canada, and Trudeau cannot do that anymore. Say, I'm different than the US president, and therefore you should vote for us again, because we don't know what the future is made of, and we could elect a political party or a leader that resembles the one you kind of fear south of the US border. At the same time, I'm not an expert of Canadian politics, and I didn't look at the polls recently, but it seems like the other parties are not very able right now to compete efficiently with Justin Trudeau. Of course, 5-6 months in politics is a long time. We'll see what happens, especially in these times that are very uncertain, COVID-19, et cetera, et cetera. But right now, Justin Trudeau is on campaign mode. I can tell you that. The other parties too, but it seems like they're not able to compete at this time.
Nice response, Frederick, for a foreign policy guy. That was very good. I want to ask everybody who's with us in the audience at this time to thank Dr. Gagnon for a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Fred, very, very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the questions too.
And I'm going to turn the microphone over to Amy. Amy, please.
Okay, at this time, I am going to ask for our audience feedback via the Zoom poll being presented on the screen. Thank you so much for participating in our poll. And also thank you to Dr. Kirby and Dr. Gagnon for presenting this important and timely conversation on Canada. Many special thanks to our virtual audience participants and to our supporters at SUNY Plattsburgh, the U.S. Department of Education, and the Quebec Ministry of International Relations and La Francophonie. I'd like to remind you that recordings of the Conversations on Canada sessions are publicly available for your viewing on YouTube by visiting the Conversations on Canada YouTube channel at tinyurl.com/conversations on Canada. As we reach the end of this session, we extend our best wishes to you for good health and a productive, successful spring and summer seasons. While the Conversations on Canada Spring 2021 series is concluding with this session, we look forward to inviting your participation to join us when we start back up again this fall. In the meantime, we extend an invitation to educators to consider participating in another round of webinar series we are hosting that begins tomorrow. As part of our National Resource Center on Canada mandate for educator outreach, we are launching a series beginning tomorrow titled The Canadian Mosaic, Material and Methods for Teaching About Multicultural Canada, which runs from April 27 to May 19 with weekly presentations each Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time and Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. To view the series program, check out tinyurl.com/Canadian Mosaic Spring 2021. And there you will see that the sessions this week are being presented by Natasha Henry, first on Tuesday, April 27 at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on the topic of I had heard that Canada was a land of liberty. African Americans pursue freedom in Canada during the 19th century. And second, on Wednesday, April 28th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, the topic is Ideas, Pedagogy, and Resources for Teaching African North American History. For more information and to register for these and 6 other sessions on topics ranging from digital literacy and Canadian citizenship, Canadian perspectives on human rights, and Métis history, culture, and nation building, please visit tinyurl.com/Canadian Mosaic Spring 2021. Well, folks, on a final note, this concludes our Conversations on Canada Spring 2021 series. Thank you sincerely and truly for your kind interest and attention. We look forward to seeing everyone back in fall 2021. Be well and have a good day.